All right, 302. I always hate stalling at the front end, so I'm so antsy to get these conversations started. So good for you for being on time, you 35 people. We're gonna let others, of course, just trickle in, but I am gonna get started because our time is finite and we are excited to be in conversation today. My name is Lisa Johnson. I'm the executive director and founder of Private School Village. If you don't know me, I'm the woman that arrives in your inbox regularly. I am thrilled to have this conversation today. As you know, hopefully, we have just launched a elementary scholarship program for PSV. And in doing so, it raised a lot of great things for us to consider. First and foremost, how we think about money and financial aid models and everything that you can imagine would come along with wanting to create a scholarship program. And thanks to PSV community engagement leader Denise Rohrig, when we started down this path of having all these great questions come up, she immediately was like, Chloe B. McKenzie, we've got to talk to Chloe B. McKenzie. And so we are going to hear from her today. She has been just a tremendous asset to us. And I feel strongly that this is the beginning of a great relationship. But today we're going to learn a lot more about something, again, that is paramount to each family in PSV, and that is money, and specifically as it relates to our school experiences and just our everyday lives. Chloe needs little introduction. You have been given by email her bio, but she is a researcher, wealth justice activist, founder of an organization, another nonprofit called BlackFem, which works with agencies and organizations and institutions to create more opportunities to build wealth and make sure everything is fair and equal, particularly for Black women. Yay, yay, yay on that front. So I'm going to pass the mic to Chloe B. McKenzie. I do just want to remind you that this conversation is being recorded. We will make it available following the conversation. And I'll encourage you to use the Q&A feature on Zoom. Just be aware that we are going to, when the time comes for us to entertain questions, we're going to start with the questions that were submitted in advance through RSVP. And I'll be moderating the additional questions that come in on Q&A and throwing them to Chloe as we have time. So please, Chloe.
Thank you so much for having me, everybody, and I'm so excited for the budding relationship with the PSV community. I'm so excited that I get to spend my Sunday with you all. And to Lisa's point, I know it's 3 p.m. where you all are. It is 6 p.m. where I am, and that means toddler dinner time. So if you hear that, we're just going to keep it pushing. So again, really, really grateful to be here today. I am a big believer in, and especially in a virtual setting, if you want to give snaps or questions or anything like that, Lisa, as she mentioned, is going to monitor the Q&A, but the chat space is there for us to be in community and conversation with each other. So please feel free to use it. And again, if you're kind of like, yeah, girl, really appreciate that because I love to feel the energy through the screen as much as I can. All right, so let's get started. Okay, I'm gonna pretend like I know technology. Okay, just gonna get into my view here. All right, and I can share my screen now. Okay, so the reason why we're here today is to answer this question around what is wealth justice. And so what I want to be able to do is first just open up by saying, I'm going to be vulnerable. I feel safe enough to do so because a lot of answering some of these bigger questions, and thank you for those who submitted the questions in advance, for us to get to, I have to explain how I even got to the theory and the definitions in the first place. And a lot of that was through self-exploration. I am the product of a private school education. And so I have to, again, bring up my own personal history for us to really understand, well, how the heck does she do what she does in the world? How did she come up with these definitions? How does she apply it in her work? And I can't do that without telling you who I am. So I just want to gently offer you all a trigger warning that I will bring up some experiences of abuse. I will use terms like trauma and things like that. So I just want to gently offer that trigger warning for those that may need that. And we'll move on. Okay, so about me. So I'm Chloe McKenzie. I grew up in Prince George's County, Maryland, and it is a very unique place because it is one of only 7 counties in the entire country where Black families have more wealth than white families. Obviously, this is something that did not dawn on me until well into after, getting out of college. But I did not really understand how much that would shape my understanding of the world, how much that would influence my relationship with money and value and wealth and worth. But it is something that is so deeply connecting, deeply connected to my work. So in Prince George's County, Maryland, I went to public school until I was in the 8th grade. And then I went to a private high school. For me, I ultimately kind of spent my life really understanding or feeling like I was enacting this premise that education was my way to experience safety. So I grew up incredibly privileged. I didn't know what it was to not get everything not only that I needed, but that I wanted. But I grew up in an incredibly abusive household. And so much of that was the tension that I started to explore later on in life after I started to begin to study the wealth gap and why it is so severe, particularly for people of color, particularly for Black people, and even more particularly for Black women. And so, a lot of people ultimately, talk about how education leads them on this trajectory to success, or you can fill in the blank in any which way. But in retrospect, again, I'm very particular about talking about that education was my safe place. And when I think about that, I think about how much privilege there is in being able to say that. As a lot of people, I know I don't need to kind of tell you all, but that's not something that is systematically offered to everybody by default. And so because I knew what that felt like from a very young age, despite kind of all of the turmoil and horror that I experienced as a child, this tension between my own privilege but my ability to access safety is something that has colored my understanding of what money means to me and what I ultimately think money means to a lot of different people. So as we discussed, I went to a private school, again, because I was privileged. Well, I'm a self-proclaimed nerd, and I'm very proud of that. So I ended up skipping 2 grades. So when I was a freshman in high school, I was actually 12 years old. So as a 12-year-old, experiencing sexual and physical and financial abuse at home, I ultimately will never forget that I sat myself down as a 12-year-old and said to myself, all right, you're in private school. This is a college or preparatory environment. You don't have, quote unquote, any other barriers other than sticking your nose in a book and participating in as many extracurriculars as possible to be the most competitive college candidate that you can be. And that is what I said that I would do, because I knew that if I could, become the most competitive college candidate, I could go anywhere. I could go as far away as I needed to again, be able to experience and secure and restore that sense of safety. And that's exactly what I did. So I had, the 4.2, and I was student body president. I was captain of the soccer team. I was the commentator at the basketball games and all of these different things. But again, I was able to understand that what was affording me the opportunity to experience safety was deeply rooted in my own privilege that in some ways I began to reject, but also ended up saving me in many ways. So when I finally was able to get my license at 15 and 16, I would drive to school at 3 in the morning and sleep in the car and then go to school because I knew what it meant to be prepared to be in a learning environment, not just because it made me feel safe, but because I knew that it was a part of this bigger mission. Because of what I was able to accomplish in high school, I ended up going to Amherst College, which is a, elite liberal arts school. And again, remember where I grew up. So Black people had money, we had privilege, we had wealth. And I'm thinking to myself, like, okay, I also, let's be real, I still understood how the world worked in terms of racial dynamics. So when I got to Amherst College, I knew what I would experience, but I didn't know at the same time. I'm talking like the privilege that I grew up around was people owned homes and cars and were doctors and lawyers and things like that. But I'm talking, I got to Amherst and people have like $30 million trust funds. I'm like, this is kind of mind blowing. And so though I experienced the safety that I did in high school, part of what I realized my education afforded me again was the opportunity in the space to think about what did I need in order to secure that sense of safety. And I don't know, I always think about this to myself, but like how at the age of 15, despite everything that I was going through, I had the wherewithal to know that when my parents were going through a really nasty divorce, then the state of Maryland, you can request time with a judge and a court advocate to advocate for what would go into the final settlement of the divorce for yourself, as long as you're 15 and older. I started to read a whole bunch of law books and family law books and things like that. And what I was able to do was, in the legally binding settlement of my parents' divorce, I got my college and my siblings' college paid for. So I was able to enter this, again, super privileged environment, but I knew that I'd be able to leave it completely debt-free. So I tell you all of these things because I hope you can start to see how much I felt as though, again, it chokes me up because I think about my own kids of being like, I hope at 12 and 15 they're not having to think this far ahead and this strategically. But so much of how I was able to position myself and secure my own sense of safety had to do with how I leveraged privilege and how I leveraged financial privilege and my relationship with money. After college, I actually went to Wall Street. I thought I was going to be a lawyer. My best friend's dad at the time, said, you're going to hate law school. You don't need I'm going to be blunt here and use our direct quote. He's like, you don't need a bunch of white dudes telling you about how poorly law is written. You already know this. So don't waste the money. And so he was also, very, very high up at a large investment bank in New York City. And he said, listen, I know I'm typecasting you, but we need more women on the trading floor and we need more people of color on the trading floor. So I'll make a deal with you. Can you come and intern with me for a summer? And if you love it, then you'll get a full-time job offer on Wall Street as a trader after college. If you hate it, I will pay for all of your law school applications and your LSAT course. And I was like, bet. I knew I was going to hate it, but I was going to get my LSAT stuff paid for and all of the things. Well, of course, I ended up loving it. I ended up getting the full-time offer and going to be a trader on Wall Street. And interestingly enough, again, if you've seen the movie Hidden Figures, I was the Taraji P. Henson on a floor full of 300 white men, and I was the only Black woman. And in many ways, I also played soccer in college. And so for me, I felt that competitiveness. I kind of love to be subversive. I call it being righteously petty. And so that was kind of the world that I got to go into because it was so cutthroat and just gross. Unfortunately, so every kind of long strip of rows of people, all of which were traders who shouted at each other. And there was one particular role called douchebag row. I'm sure you can understand what the environment was like there. And of course, I was seated there. My first day, my boss didn't say, hi, Chloe, how's it going? Or what school did you come from? He literally said, hey, what's your name? And what's 2 to the 5th power? To which I said, Chloe McKenzie, 32. So these are some of the experiences that, again, being in financial spaces, I constantly felt like there was this battle, this struggle to not only secure a position where I could feel grounded, but secure a position where I could feel safe and like I wasn't being constantly attacked. On Wall Street, I traded everything from mortgages, student loans, credit card receivables, and auto loans. So the debt that average Americans touch. And fun fact about the boss who was, kind enough to ask me what 2 to the 5th power was, he happened to be the head of mortgage trading at Lehman Brothers. So yes, he blew up the American economy and I had to work underneath of him. So again, these power dynamics and thinking about like, why are we doing the same practices that ruined the entire American economy, that wiped out nearly all of Black wealth that had been built over decades. And so I felt morally bankrupt incredibly fast. And so in order to make myself feel better on nights and weekends, I worked at a homeless shelter where I became a financial counselor. And I was totally unimpressed and deeply frustrated by the approaches and the solutions that people had to the gender and racial wealth gap. I felt as though it was very plain and it never really captured the true texture of what it was like to struggle against wealth inequality, particularly for Black people and even more particularly for Black women. After getting sick, I was in and out of the hospital for about 6 months and went through 5 liver surgeries in the span of 3 months. Never granted medical leave. In fact, my boss sent me a VPN, which is a private Wi-Fi for my hospital bed, and an iPad and a laptop computer where I had to continue working. In between my 3rd and 4th surgery, I said to myself at 21, if this is going to be your last on the planet, this cannot be the legacy that you leave behind. And so I finally committed to myself in saying that for all the time that I have left on this planet, it will be in the purpose of closing the gender and racial wealth gap, because that is what you are interested in. That is what people are spending the least amount of time on. And so that is kind of how I came to today, to building BlackFem, to rethinking what wealth justice is, to introducing kind of new iterations of what BlackFem does, and then opening my research institution that studies wealth justice. And what I've kind of found out around wealth justice and how I got to this place was, if you recall, so much of this time, of course, when I was, kind of battling the reality of facing my own mortality at 21 and everything that I had endured up until that point, I ultimately, again, came back to this question of, well, what is influencing so much of my financial experiences? Because again, despite these horrifying things that I was going through in the hospital, I had health insurance, I had a Wall Street salary, I had Wall Street bonuses. And so what I wanted to then start to really ask myself is, what is the greatest influence on a person's wealth building capability? Because I, admittedly thought that it was just financial knowledge, or what people would call financial literacy, but that's actually just not true, right? The largest financial institutions invest over $100 billion in financial education every year to yield, are you ready? Less than 0.3% of any type of move in terms of wealth building capability and mobility. So that tells you all you need to know about what financial literacy or financial knowledge does and how much of an influence it has. And so what I then said was, okay, let's look at me, Chloe. I think I'm a good case study because on the one hand, I had a lot of financial privilege that got me into private school and to a private college and all of these other places. But I also in many ways was very disprivileged because I was housing insecure. I could go back home, but I would have to experience unthinkable abuse. So I'd live in my car. I was food insecure in college, but so I ended up working 3 jobs, all of these kind of different things to be able to color my experience. And what I ended up finding out is that wealth and trauma are inextricably linked. And again, I don't think this is a revolutionary idea, because I think we can all think, well, duh, because look at the inception of our country, right? Our entire economic system was premised on slavery and stealing indigenous land. Probably some of the most horrifying acts of trauma that could be perpetrated against people. And so that being the case, we can't delink the two. That in many ways, according to my research, in order to build or amass great amounts of wealth, I'm talking Jeff Bezos level wealth, it requires violence. And so in many ways, when we participate in an economy that is built this way, and in many ways, the economy that was built at the inception of America really looks very much the same. It's just kind of tweaked in different ways. And we'll talk about financial trauma in a second. It's been tweaked to kind of align with the gains that we were able to achieve in terms of civil rights, et cetera. But it still participates in what I call economic violence. It still perpetrates economic violence. It still requires that people who look like us, who are basically not the architects or the power brokers of our economic system, it requires us to experience economic violence in order to be able to fully participate in the economy and enjoy greater senses of safety. And in fact, that is my central premise that we have to understand if we want to understand wealth justice. And that is that the central feature of our economic system is trauma. Now, I'm not doing this in a way that, Hollywood goes full on like trauma, everything's trauma. That's not actually what I'm saying here. But what I am saying is that at every kind of instance of when and how our economic system moves, the amount of violence that is that in many ways the system requires us to experience can lead to traumatic experiences. Everybody's different, so it may be traumatic for one person and not for another, but the fact that we are required to experience violence to fully participate is the problem, and therefore makes our economic system kind of situated in this reality that the central feature is trauma. And so that ultimately begs the question, what is wealth justice? And I think a lot of people, when they hear the term at first, it provides a warmth, but I hope in many ways it also provides moments of feeling perplexed a little bit, because you're kind of like, oh, what would that mean? And in many ways, I think that's the purpose. It's meant to evoke so many different things of what it would mean for us to feel like we are receiving and participating in a just system where we can experience wealth. So the first thing that I'll say before I define wealth justice is I define wealth in a very different way. And you'll see throughout what I call my lexicon, or the words that I use to describe how we experience our economy, I think about wealth not in dollars and cents. And I actually think when we use dollars and cents or quantities too much, we're actually participating in an effort to sanitize the real violence, right? So we can talk about violence as in how many people have been harmed, which is important. But what's more important than how many is what does the harm do to us, and how bad is it? And so this is what I think about in terms of wealth, but in the affirmative, which is to say that for me, wealth is about understanding what is your vision for peace or groundedness or safety, any of those words in that realm, and how do we fund it? So for me, like, I actually have no desire to be a millionaire. Is that a possibility? It's possible for anybody. But the idea behind it for me is what I ultimately feel as though will bring me peace and make me feel grounded and make me feel safe are, my kids being taken care of, them having access to a good education, being able to have a home that feels safe and warm and completely antithetical to what I grew up in. And how much do I need in order to fund that vision? And to me, I know that that's not $1,000,000. And so in some ways, wealth is really just about options, and not only options, but it's about self-definition. You get to define what that means. And I think we are conditioned to believe in the images and the definitions that are out there that I think are a part, again, of this bigger economic system that's perpetrating violence. So what is wealth justice? Wealth justice is not just about building material wealth, or what we know as like the private jets and all of these other things. But to me, wealth justice is about healing financial trauma. And so hopefully you're kind of asking yourself, well, what is that, Chloe? Well, here's what I want to do in this first section. Before we kind of really go into the financial aid experience, I want you to actually learn about these three kind of key components of my wealth justice framework and what they mean. Because I believe that if we can take these words and phrases and apply it, frankly, in any economic context, we in many ways have taken back some of our power, and we can participate in what I call blame shifting, which allows us to kind of more effectively navigate a system that was designed to be violent or have violent outcomes. So we know that wealth justice is really about healing financial trauma. What we can understand financial trauma to be is it is the effect of being systematically exploited, harmed, and or betrayed by an economic system and institutions to concentrate wealth and power. So I want to talk about this that's not in such a kind of my nerdy abstract way. But the first couple of things that I do want to highlight here. I want to be clear that I wrote the definition in this way to put the spotlight on the system and not the people, right? So we, again, not to say that we should not prioritize the people who are the trauma is thrust upon, but again, we tend to individualize experiences, and then we tend to blame individuals for the harm that they experience. And that is one of the things that I want us to be aware of, because that happens a lot in financial aid experiences. So this is how I think about what I call the cycle of financial trauma, because the way that our economic system was built and how our culture works and all of these other things it makes financial trauma actually self-perpetuating, which is really scary, but again, deeply effective. So what happens is some type of financial trauma is perpetrated. That can be something as egregious as redlining, right? Or, denying access to capital just because of the color of our skin or because of our gender. Or it could actually be something as mundane and terrible as not being able to get our credit score unless we actually do a hard credit pull. So I have tons of research that we could talk about at another time that actually demonstrates how psychologically harmful it is that a lender gets to know our real credit score, but we as consumers only get access to our educational credit score, which is off by plus or minus 40 points. And we don't actually get access to that information until after a lender has seen it. So that information asymmetry, which, this is just because, right? There's no actually really good reason or case law behind it. It's just the way that it's been. But again, thinking about those mundane and terrible experiences can be traumatizing as well. So what happens is the trauma gets perpetrated and then the affected person responds. And we can respond in many different ways. But again, when we think about using trauma-informed practices, our responses can be everything from it not phasing us, which is totally fine, or to everything to completely avoiding finances altogether, which to me, I don't see as a personality defect, though a lot of people try to claim that. I see it as a trauma response. So that affected person will respond. That trauma response is typically judged from a cultural perspective. You can think to the welfare queen trope that was used heavily in the Reagan administration, or even more recently through the pandemic, right, when there was the political debates around whether the check should be sent for a second or even third time, and what are those people using to spend it on, and all of these other things. So that the responses to the trauma that we're experiencing are often judged culturally. And then society as a whole adopts and pushes this narrative that begins with the, again, power brokers of the system. And then there are experiences of financial shame, which I'll go into here shortly. The shame then in many ways kind of automatically, because that's how trauma works, it kind of is an automatic response. It's very reflexive. It actually leads us to choose to limit or not participate as fully as we may like, which again makes total sense to me. But then the system at some point forces us to participate because we have to secure either our basic needs or other types of things, and then the cycle continues. So it's this self-perpetuating cycle. And this is one of the things that I'll go through, that if we actually put this in a financial aid context, in many ways the same thing happens, right? So the application in and of itself could be incredibly triggering. There's a lot of words and terms that we may not know. When we seek help, which is the right participating in the economic experience, and we're met with judgment or surprise or, kind of any of these things that make us feel like there's something wrong with us as opposed to something happened to us, then creates this sense of shame. And then we may choose to put the application aside or try to finish it as quickly as possible just because I want to get out of this experience, which makes perfect sense. But instead, we're then forced to participate because we are recentered by the idea that we want our kids to have access to a wonderful education. So then we have to kind of re-engage with the traumatic experience, and it kind of self-perpetuates. So again, ultimately what I want the focus to be here is, again, there's nothing wrong with you, but things are happening to you. And that is, again, one of the central understandings of wealth justice. And so here are the definitions. We went through wealth justice. It's about healing and undoing financial trauma and shame, and it's a commitment that we are able to heal from the cumulative wounding that financial trauma creates in terms of our health, wealth, and well-being. And it's the justice part is really about being able to shift the blame to the people and the institutions who are responsible for the harm in the first place. We already explained financial trauma, but financial shame to me is this effect of being told that you are to blame for the socioeconomic harm that you experience. And so what we'll do is let's put this whole thing into context here when we think about wealth justice and the private school experience. When I talk to parents or even students who participate in the financial aid process or have to engage in the financial aid experience, me being one of them. So again, I was lucky enough that I had the wherewithal at 15 to make sure that my college would be paid for, but that didn't mean that I didn't have to engage with the financial aid office. As a part of just rules that exist because of the Department of Education, I had to prove that my parents were abusive in order to get access to certain things when I went to college. Which again, this is that kind of triggering part of the demonstrate your need situation. And so oftentimes, anytime I talk to anybody, like, what was your financial aid experience like? It boils down, it gets paraphrased into this premise that financial aid triggers me. And what I want to do by saying this is at least validate that that is a very, very common experience, particularly for those who do not enjoy gender and racialized privilege, right? If we don't come for, I appreciate Denise for providing some of the schools in PSV their financial aid applications. And the case study that we're going to go through, I took from some of these websites so I can show you the ways in which I counsel financial aid offices to put a wealth justice lens on the financial aid experience, because it not only can be triggering, which can happen inadvertently, but it also can be triggering on purpose. And so they're not to say that people are actively trying to be harmful, but the continuous use of language that I think people are now aware is problematic is a choice. And so these are moments where financial trauma and financial shame show up in the process. And so I want to show you from my vantage point how I begin to equip financial aid offices with better strategies and approaches to adopting a wealth justice framework. And I'm doing this because I don't think that you have to, come in and consult for a financial aid office to actually demand that this be your experience. I think as parents, what I always kind of offer to people is that the lexicon that you've now been given is one way, the kind of cheesy saying my therapist always says, right? If you can name it, you can tame it, right? And so this is the opportunity to leverage this lexicon. And I'm going to demonstrate for you what that would look like so that when you're engaging in a financial aid process or with financial aid officers, that you can bring this wealth justice lexicon to the fore and use it, because I think that it actually does shift power dynamics, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So in the world of financial aid, I would say some of the most triggering, whether that is inadvertent or kind of more purposeful, triggering words are rooted in the word need, right? So there's need-based financial aid, and I would say the most commonly used one that I don't think is frankly as updated, but right, the most updated is demonstrated financial need. And so what I want us to think about is let's just kind of go through and pretend we are all consultants together and we're sitting around our table to help out this school. And typically what I usually do first is I occupy the position of a person who would come to this financial aid office and say, let's look at all the terms that are used in your brochures and your videos. And if I went to a session and I learned from somebody in person. And oftentimes what we hear in these financial aid sessions are words like this. You can hear no loan for some of the, I think, schools who think that they're further along. There's need blind. And so some of these words are, we accept students from across the country or, wherever, and based not on family income, but rather achievement and promise. Here's the demonstrated financial need again, which I end up, what I've done underneath, if there's something underneath, it's usually because I've synthesized all of these words and tried to actually come up with what are they actually saying, because we don't know, right? They're really sexy words that make you feel like this is accessible to me. And then when it comes time to accessing the very thing that they're promising, it feels very inaccessible. But demonstrated financial need for the vast majority of financial aid offices that I've worked with is really a calculation. It's about the cost of attendance to go to the school, less how much they are expecting the family to contribute financially to the entire process. And whatever's left over is how much they feel as though you need in terms of financial aid. There's also kind of been a movement around talking about 100% of our students' demonstrated need that they, the financial aid covers. So there are a lot of, let's be real, marketing tools to talk about that this is an accessible place for us. This is inclusive, and we want to have socioeconomically diverse student populations. And I'm not suggesting, even though I'm sure you all can read slightly my petty tone here, it's Sunday, so it's Real Housewives night. So that's just what's comes out from me. Sorry, but it's not that they don't necessarily believe this, but again, thinking about putting a trauma-informed wealth justice lens on these things means something different to somebody who actually feels as though they have a very real need, and it's coming from a place from having experienced repeated systematic trauma. Financial aid, the best part, one of my favorite activities when I work with financial aid offices, and I ask them, what is financial aid? What does it mean? And a lot of people have 6 different answers, and they are in the same office. I'll go over that in a second. And then the final is family contribution. And a lot of the applications that Denise sent me in the kind of PSV world, it was very interesting that family contribution was everything from the amount of money that people expect families to have. One application went as far as to say that even if there is a non-working parent, they will go ahead and just calculate what they perceive your income to be, which is a lot. I'll leave it at that. But so I just want everybody to kind of be aware that these terms are incredibly broad. They're often not defined. And this is where I want you to come back to, again, thinking about wealth justice and what it means to participate in an economic experience where there is information asymmetry, right? There's a power dynamic. It's not just about, I want money and you have money to give. That's, of course, the premise of the power dynamic. But what makes the power dynamic that much more insidious almost is that these kind of big words or these lofty ideas are not defined. And that's a choice. That's a choice. And so these are things that the first thing I always say to people participating in these processes is go ask them what it means and get a clear answer. And if they give you a definition that still doesn't make sense, ask them to clarify. So what is financial aid? I did this activity for the first time actually with a college financial aid office, and it was probably one of the most transformative experiences that I've even had. And so I actually wanted to share kind of what came out of it. And to be honest with you, I think that what they came to conclude when they defined what financial aid is something that should be widely adopted, because I think it demonstrates what putting wealth justice and financial trauma in context actually looks like if you are trying to become that apparatus of a school institution that is making things more diverse and inclusive. So what ended up happening was we created a grounding message which defines what financial aid is. So the financial aid office says we provide the resources, both material and non-material. So that's the first thing that I'll kind of highlight here is when we're in financial aid spaces, do we also see that there are non-material resources? In other words, it doesn't have to do with the money, but again, do you have resources that define anything, that close the information asymmetry and support? So they provide resources and support that empower students and their families to shape the types of financial and socioeconomic experiences they have in college and beyond. Deeply moving, because what this essentially is saying is the financial aid office is promising to provide resources and support, and that does not always mean that it's the funding, but it provides an extra network that families can leverage to then shape what types of financial and socioeconomic experiences they want to have, right? We ultimately understand that education is one of those key tried and true ways of pathways to economic mobility, but who's actually helping us get there? We all know that just getting the degree or getting the education, getting through the K-12 diploma process is not actually the main antidote. It's how are we supporting and being an underpinning this effort to reshape what our financial experiences are going to look like. And so I gave examples of what that might look like. And again, this is where I said, Financial aid offices need to be clear. You said material and non-material. Somebody's going to ask, what does that mean? And that is very true. So the material parts are providing grants and grants-only aid packages, work-study programs, emergency aid for students during the school term, health insurance, and again, this is a college. Non-material would be financial education resources and supportive networks. And so they ended up adopting that they would do monthly activities with parents and students to again talk them through just financial experiences, making sure that they have access to banking, all of these kind of different socioeconomic experiences and supportive practices that could be implemented if they thought about it, if they thought that that's what financial aid was. What ended up happening is then we changed the entire lexicon of the office. They went from the no loan, which was actually not true because some students ended up having to take out loans. So then you're not a no loan apparatus. You have grants and scholarship only, which, as we know, that grants don't always meet the full cost of attendance. Student summer savings, unbilled expenses. So I'm just giving you some examples here of what we can require from our financial aid offices, which is to say, give me all of your buzzwords and then define them. I'll speed up here because I'm looking at time. But this is kind of what I mentioned already before, right? What is triggering about the financial aid experience is that there's so much information asymmetry. And when we understand how and why something is happening, we can practice restoring our senses of safety. So if we understand that demonstrated financial need actually could be changed to, and that's what we did. Whoops, what'd I do? Time out, folks, sorry. What we actually did was trying to talk and do this at the same time. I'm not very good at multitasking, even though I'm a mom. Okay. Okay, so what we actually did here was we changed demonstrated financial need to calculated financial need, because what this meant was this word about having to demonstrate my need then made me feel like I had to demonstrate why I had an unfortunate financial experience 5 years ago, or why I had a bankruptcy on my report, or why I have a high rent payment, or why my mortgage is higher than the value of my home. Like demonstrating versus recognizing that calculating financial need is actually what financial aid offices are trying to do to then provide the amount of money that they are, one, able to, but two, feel as though your family needs in order to participate in the scholastic experience. So when can these words be triggering? Well, at any time. And actually, I did research on this. So according to my work, underrepresented families, so those essentially who don't enjoy racial, gender, and financial privilege, were 4 times more likely to experience financial shame when completing financial aid applications. And the reason why I bring up this statistic is because I want you to, again, one, feel validated. I hope that you now have a term that you can use to explain why this application may be making it seem like the socioeconomic harm that you've experienced throughout your lifetime is your fault, and now I have to talk about it on this application. But I also want you to be aware that this is something you can name if you feel empowered enough or safe enough to do so to the financial aid office. Because again, the way that the vast majority of these applications are written, or their criteria or their standards, can invoke so much shame and then make the process itself, again, traumatizing. So demonstrating financial need means something very different to someone like me. And that was a quote that I had from a parent, because what she ended up talking about was demonstrating financial need to me, I'm speaking as her. She said, to me, it means that I have to demonstrate why I'm poor. And again, that is a very valid thing to have felt. And I want to say that that is not what financial aid offices are doing, but it is their responsibility to know when that is happening. And so what that is going to take are groups like PSV, people like me, and hopefully, again, if you feel safe and empowered enough, people like you to say, this is a consequence of having participated in your process, and you need to be aware of it. You need to be aware of it. So again, I talked to you about why we changed from demonstrated financial need to calculated financial need, because that little word changed the experience for many people. And as we know, applications themselves can not only be traumatizing, but they can be re-traumatizing. Because again, if we're asked to demonstrate, well, why are you in this position, or why do you need this money, in many ways, again, feels attacking, because that's what trauma does, right? A smell, a sound can send us back to different forms of trauma. And if participating in our economy is traumatizing, then when people are questioning you to get information, and using words that haven't been clearly defined, it can put us back in that cycle. I'm going to speed through this last part, and then I'd love to open it up. I talked about this, but the kind of evil genius of financial trauma is that it keeps us from healing by preventing us from changing our own socioeconomic circumstances. So remember that circle, right? What often happens is when people experience financial trauma, are re-traumatized, the typical, if you kind of understand trauma kind of colloquially, a lot of people talk about the fight and flight response, or the fight, flight, and freeze response. Well, freeze is actually the most like kind of biologically old response, but flight is the most common. And so what I look at that is a lot of people then choose not to do something. And again, this happens a lot in the financial aid process, particularly at the college level. And I just want, again, to remind you that that doesn't mean something's wrong with you. It actually makes perfect sense. Why would we want to do something that is causing this much trauma or re-traumatizing us? But then we feel forced to, because we can realign ourselves around like what was the promise we made to our kids and our children and things like that. So I just want, again, I wanted to take the opportunity throughout this talk to really hopefully empower you with new language that you can use, help you kind of understand that what part of the work is for us is, now that we have this language, we can actually shift the blame back where it belongs. Rather than thinking there's something wrong with us, we can believe that something happened to us, because that's what's happening when we participate. Rather than thinking about the fact that we have a personality defect because we might choose to not fill out the application as thoroughly as we wanted to because it was so traumatizing. That's not a personality defect, that's a trauma response. We can think about it in much different ways that we're not actually taught to do that, because that is ultimately the kind of the central feature of our economic system and how it actually works in this small microcosm in the financial aid context. And so I talk about that here, right? So limiting your participation, like choosing not to do something, it's not a personality defect, it's a trauma response. And always coming back to the idea that education was my way to experience safety. And perhaps the way that we can think about this is when we continue to understand it from this lens, particularly for financial aid offices, it then becomes their task of making sure that getting to that desired education does require us to feel safe throughout the entire process. Would love to take questions, and thank you so much.
Woo! Chloe. Okay, first of all, you cannot drop all of that on us and expect us to wrap up nice and neatly.
Please, well, I'm happy to stay over. I went over, so I'm sorry for everybody's
No.
time.
Look, you and I, we knew coming into this is the beginning. And I just have to say to everyone tuning in, like the stuff that's coming into me on my cell phone, on the chat in the Q&A is nothing but aha moments of validation and a craving for more of this. And PSV certainly has a role to play in helping all of our schools and families get to a better place around all of this. I will be the first to admit that I'd never even conceptualized this whole idea. I knew I felt a certain kind of way talking about money and financial aid in the private school setting and all that, but I feel like I have probably contributed to the problem. I'm sure I've used the word financial need in an inappropriate way. And so that would be my first question. How do we start with ourselves? How do we check ourselves in terms of reframing how we're talking about it with our communities, with our children, with our schools in a really positive and empowering way? But there's so much unlearning and conditioning to address.
Yes, there is so much unlearning. And to your point, starting with yourself, I appreciate you, Lisa, for saying that, right? Like the early parts of my career when I went into the wealth justice space, I was drinking the Kool-Aid of this idea that we can somehow learn to budget, save, and invest our way out of poverty, right? Like through financial literacy. So I think when we begin to rhetorically interrogate, like, how could this actually shape somebody's experience? And is this word clearly defined? Is it creating confusion kind of on purpose, right? And again, the information asymmetry to me, if we're giving people a little bit of grace, is to be able to give the financial aid office the space that they need to make really hard decisions about a finite amount of money.
Right.
What I can also say though is that's not our problem. It's just
Right.
not. And that does not justify why we will continue to use a methodology that causes harm, that causes trauma, that causes shame. And so that's kind of the first place that I start. One, from our lens, which is to say that I want us to just really start thinking about the words and phrases that we've adopted and think that are okay. And again, this isn't to say that we're the perpetrators, but again, what I talked about with the credit scores, for example, like I never thought to myself that like the way that we get our credit scores was harmful until I started to study it. And I was like, wow. And then I went down the rabbit hole and I was like, why is it like this? And I was like, oh, just because that's the way the credit bureaus lobbied it in the 70s. Like, that's it. It's not, there's no other reason that just because people wrote it that way, right? And so we realized that the trauma is coming from some of the most mundane parts of participating in the economy. So there's that side of it. And then to your point about our kids, you know, I think now knowing this language, we all want to say, like, I hope my kids don't experience financial trauma. And we all know as parents, we cannot shield our kids as much as we want to.
This is America.
I know, right? It's like, good luck. But what I always say is this: it is actually going to be more beneficial to your child to know about, again, in an age appropriate way, to know that they are going to be harmed by the system. And that is actually the design of the system. And so teaching them to know, hey, this was a choice that I made and I have to be responsible for my choices. But the rest of this was not a choice that was given to me. This was an experience thrust upon me. Knowing how to blame shift is actually, according to my research, more beneficial to a person's wealth building capability than actually knowing how to invest, budget, save, and all of these other things. Yep.
I'm gonna need to use that quote. That's interesting. Okay, so I just want to get to a few questions and then we have one in the queue. And again, everyone, not the last time we're going to be talking about this or hearing from Miss McKenzie. I loved this question. I personally find advocating for financial assistance from white private school administrators very difficult. How can I feel more empowered? How can middle-class working families who aren't used to asking for financial aid feel more empowered in approaching schools about needing it? Did I freeze?
Okay, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes, I thought it was me.
Okay. No, I think it was me. I have no idea. We joked about this, Lisa, right? I was like, come
Yes.
on, just
At least it waited until
okay.
the very end. Okay, so
Right.
basically,
I did not.
I don't know what you heard, but the question is, how can parents immediately feel more empowered? Again, we don't want anyone to go try and burn the school process down for financial, like there's a lot of
Yes.
work to be done
Yes.
here. And we're trying to be,
Yes.
we've not thought about it. So a lot of our schools probably haven't thought about it either. So let's give some grace, but we are on
Correct.
it. But that
Mhm.
said,
Yeah.
how do we immediately feel more empowered?
Immediately, what I would do, and I do this exercise even when I'm brought in as a consultant. I'll go to the financial website or to the financial aid application, and I write down every term that I see that I don't have a very clear definition about. And then I will show up in person or send a gentle email saying, hey, I actually need the clearer definitions of what this is. I think this does multiple things. One, again, it demonstrates that that's actually their responsibility to give you that information. So I find that to be empowering. But I also think, to your point, it begins to plant a seed. And if enough parents do this, it's an activity that's going to force the office itself to potentially put up that as a resource.
So I'm going to go out on a limb and say most of us tuning in are new to this whole concept. What are the apps and or experts that a Chloe B. McKenzie leans on?
Um,
Any
you
books?
know, this
Any, like, if you want to continue this learning, if PSV is doing it too slow for you, you are so amped up from this call now that you're like, I got to have it now. What would you suggest?
So that was the one question I was like, okay, how do I answer this? One, without being petty, but two, without feeling discouraging. So I'll say this, I want everybody to actually be very righteously skeptical about the apps that are out there. And it's not to say that they all ultimately have positive things to them, but just remember the kind of culture that we're in, that most of the advice or education you're going to get is going to assume that the vast majority of your personal choices are going to lead to some type of financial outcome, and we know that that's not the case, right? So the vast majority of our financial experiences are dictated for us, and then we have some agency in that. But these apps and kind of educational resources kind of do it in reverse. So there's that. But yeah, I mean, I think for me, what I actually spend more time looking at, is I would suggest looking more at how does our economic system work, and some of the things that I'll offer as things to read about. I'll be honest, some of them are kind of dense, but they're really good. So the first is the Code of Capital is really interesting because it actually demonstrates to you like how our economic system was built, and why it was built. A really great read, where you'll learn a lot just about the education system, and how it intersects with the economic system, is called Weapons of Math Destruction. Wonderful book. And also, especially in the age of AI, kind of really takes your mind in different places. I do have a forthcoming book that hopefully is coming out this year, so we'll stay tuned on that. But I do think that, again, the vast majority of the resources out there are helpful if you know how to take what's there for you and leave the rest of the shaming and traumatizing over here. Which, so in other words, I always tell people, prepare yourself to have to navigate that, because that's the extra work other than reading and comprehending.
Yeah. And you mentioned early on in your talk about financial literacy not being an indicator for building wealth,
Mhm.
but you're not advocating for financial literacy.
Um, in the way that it exists now, I actually don't advocate for it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think for me, financial education needs to do two things. First and foremost, it needs to teach people how to navigate an economic system that was designed to be violent, which it does not. And then it needs to teach people how to, then you can teach the kind of the financial concepts. And so the way I kind of, really quick example of how I do this. So I do financial education work still. But if I'm teaching about bank accounts or budgeting, I'm going to teach through experiences. And the vast majority, especially for young people, right? They're always taught to budget and like don't overspend and all these other things. But what we don't kind of talk about ever or teach people is that our bank accounts are linked to IBM computers that reorder our transactions to increase the likelihood that we're going to go into overdraft. So this idea that we're bad at spending is actually built into the system. And so this idea that like we can somehow again budget our way out of that like very oppressive, unjust act needs to be the vast majority of when we teach kids about bank accounts and budgeting, as opposed to like somehow you having a budget is going to it's going to be more beneficial, or excuse me, you're going to be able to somehow overcome the IBM computer that literally is doing millions of calculations every millisecond.
Okay. Last question coming in on the Q&A. Hi, Chloe. What are your thoughts around confidentiality of financial aid awards? Should we be sharing?
I've never thought of this question, but wow, that's a good one. I personally, other than like people's private information, I am a proponent of transparency, right? Like we talk about information asymmetry. And so I do think that there is a way to make everybody feel safe, the institution itself, and the parents. But yeah, I actually think that that is worth doing. I think about it in the same way we provide gender pay, right? Like transparency at companies and like that. I do think that there is a world in which it should be incumbent upon financial aid offices to demonstrate that if you have some type of a commitment to providing 100% of calculated financial need for the most vulnerable students, that you prove it. It can't just be a statement. And so I do actually think that there's a world in which that should come to life, but I need to think about that more. And that's actually, thank you for that. I'm probably going to think about it all night. But I think that's it is a good way to, again, balance dynamics, because I think that people will have to be accountable to and have to have an explanation for.
Yeah. Chloe, you have given us so much to think about. I mean, just the systemic piece of all of this is something that is so overlooked. The lexicon, the process itself is hugely eye-opening. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You are not done with us. No,
I'm not.
no, you are not done with Private School Village. No, thank you so much. Everyone, thank you for taking time between football games.
Yes.
Go Lions. That's for my husband. Thank you for joining us. We will be pushing out a copy of this webinar. It will be on our YouTube channel. And again, more to come, more work to be done, and just proof pudding of why it's so important that the village exists and the power of us working across schools to tackle systemic stuff like this so that it does not land on any one family, one school, one financial aid officer, but that it's something we can realize collectively. Truly priceless. So thank you, Chloe.
Thank you so much. Thank you.